Hello, I'm Steven Roy Goodman, host of Higher Education Today, a production of the University of the District of Columbia. Welcome back to the education program that connects you to contemporary issues, people, and institutions involved in the world of higher education. Today we'll be talking with Goldie Blumenstyk about her new book, American Higher Education in Crisis, What Everyone Needs to Know. Goldie is a senior writer at the Chronicle of Higher Education. She's a graduate of Colgate University and the Columbia School of Journalism, and often writes about academic research and college finances. Welcome, Goldie.
Thank you for having me.
Well, we're delighted you could be here. Well, the name of your book is American Higher Education in Crisis. Couldn't one always say that American higher education is always in crisis?
Yeah, you can. I mean, there's always some issue. But I have to say, and frankly, that was one of the reasons when I was first approached by the publishers, Oxford University Press, to write this book, I actually was a little hesitant to even go ahead and do it because it's February 2013. The headlines were just full of all this noise about the debt bubble and the crisis in higher education. And frankly, I'd been covering higher education at that point for 25 years, and I thought, I've heard this story before. We've had, there have been recessions before. And I almost didn't do the book, and but in part because I just thought this was a little bit of hyperbole. But when I stopped and thought about it a little bit, as they asked me to do, I did realize that we were at a moment that I thought, at least for my 25 years covering higher ed, that was pretty different. It felt, the problems seemed more severe and they were all sort of lining up one on top of each other. So I did ultimately kind of conclude that there was a crisis, although actually at the time I insisted on putting the question mark in the title, and I think if I was writing the book today, I'm not so sure I would even have included that question mark. So
you think that the university sector is in crisis still?
I do think there's a crisis, but it's not necessarily the crisis that people are talking about in the headlines. I don't necessarily think that higher education isn't worth it anymore. In fact, I don't think that at all. I think it's absolutely worth it. I think every statistic that we hear about the future of work and the future of future of the world suggests that having people with a higher education is going to be better for us than not having them in higher education.
Well, as you know, many critics will say, well, the concept is great that everybody should go to school, but it costs a lot of money to encourage a lot of people to go to school who may not finish.
Correct. And to me, the students starting college and not finishing, especially if they're borrowing money, debt with no degree, that is the worst problem. That's the worst situation for students to be in. So the problem right now is to make sure students who go to college go to a place that is not unaffordable to them, and also that they complete.
And how would you suggest that happen?
Oh, it's a snap. It's not easy, actually, and because as we know, the national graduation rate is something around 60%, at least for the students, for the statistics of the students that we know. And students start school and stop and start and stop a lot, and that's called swirling these days. They even have a term for it because it's such a prevalent problem. The best way to go is find a place that you can afford, and I think we should talk a little bit about affordability, because one of the reasons I actually decided to write the book was I thought there was a lot of misinformation out there about affordability. There are, not that college is cheap, but community colleges cost roughly about $3,000 a year to go on average. And you could go to a community college for your first 2 years of college and get a great start on your higher education. A lot of state universities, more than half the students at state universities go to a school where it costs less than $9,000 a year to go to a state university, in state at least. So it's not like, we do hear a lot about these colleges that cost $50,000 and $60,000 a year, and there are a few of them, and frankly, my alma mater is one of them right now. But there are certainly many places one can go where it's pretty affordable.
Okay, but let's say that's true. I know you went to Colgate University, and that's one of the schools that's quite expensive.
Very expensive school.
But doesn't Colgate University have some sort of obligation to try to reach out to people who may not be able to afford Colgate University?
Yeah, almost. I think very few people at Colgate and at schools like Colgate are paying the full freight. There are probably a percentage of the wealthy students from wealthy families who are paying that full price. But schools like, we don't need to talk that much about my college, but a lot of schools are making a great effort in providing need-based financial aid to students. In fact, it's one of the reasons that the college budgets are becoming more and more fragile these days, is the need-based aid that they're providing is actually kind of eating a hole out of the middle of their budgets. For private colleges, it's one of the fastest rising costs right now.
Well, one of the other costs, as you know, is the growth of administration at a lot of universities. Can you say a word or two about that?
Huge issue out there. The administrative bloat is the word that the critics use to describe this. Higher education has definitely gotten a lot more bureaucratized. It's a phenomenon that I've witnessed over my 25 years, but it's not just an anecdotal phenomenon. There's a lot of studies, I talk about a few of those studies in the book, that sort of talk about this rise in administrative functions at universities. Some of it, the colleges will say it's because there's a lot more regulations these days, and to some degree they're right. Colleges that do research have a lot more regulations regarding the way they conduct their research and the accountability. There's mental health issues and sort of student counseling activities that colleges are providing now that they didn't provide as extensively back when you and I were in school, for example. At the same time, there's a lot of competition for students. And so a lot of colleges are now spending a lot of money on marketing. Anybody who's a high school student who signs up for a standardized test and checks off a few boxes will find themselves inundated with materials about the colleges and the degree programs that they offer. Anybody who rides the metro here in Washington, D.C. will see the billboards in the metro advertising more likely graduate programs, but advertising a lot of activities. That competition for students has heated up in a way that was not really, it wasn't really a thing even 10 or 15 years ago, you know. But now there's colleges that have vice chancellors for marketing and communications. And
you're saying that that's bad?
I think it adds to the costs in college. At some point, it's not for me to decide to tell a college what they should and shouldn't spend their money on. I think students who are looking, and it's hard for students who are applying to colleges to get sort of a window in on that stuff. That's a problem. But I do think that there is a lot of spending on administration right now that might be questionable in some cases. Maybe less so some of the programs for student counseling. Maybe, but then again, every time you say that, a terrible tragedy happens at a campus, and people turn around and say, where were the counselors? Why didn't people spot this thing? Why wasn't that student getting help? And so really the colleges are in a little bit of a bind. Our expectations about what colleges are going to provide have changed a lot over the years, and we've ratcheted up what we expect, and now colleges are responding.
Well, that's a really interesting point, because in terms of expectations, because I often travel, I do a lot of traveling overseas, and the expectations of the university sector are quite different in other countries. So in the United States, we have this almost fascination with colleges and universities. In fact, this show is a show about higher education. And it's kind of interesting that there are so many people who really care about the education sector.
It's fascinating to me. And frankly, even I've noticed it as a Chronicle reporter, we kind of used to have that space to ourselves covering higher education. Now there are so many other publications and newsletters out there covering the same thing in the United States particularly, and overseas, frankly. There's, I think though the universities overseas, very few of them are as kind of resource rich and amenities rich as the American colleges and universities are. We have a different sort of approach here, in part because we're a little bit more of a college market here in the United States in a way that most places overseas are not.
You mentioned a few minutes ago the issue of you used the example of the vice president for marketing at a university. Now, if we had another guest on today with you, mm-hmm. and that person happened to be the vice president of marketing at the University of XYZ.
I've been on shows with that person next to me.
And how do you respond to them?
I don't think that I don't think they're evil people, and I think the job that they're doing is important, but at the end of the day, the consequence of having those positions adds to the costs. They are competing for students. They'll tell you that right off the bat. Particularly at the graduate level, there's a lot of competition right now for students, because graduate programs in many cases are not that expensive to offer, and they can help sort of underwrite the rest of the universities. So colleges are eager to get those students, and they're fighting for them right now.
And in terms of the fighting for the different students, can you say a word or two about the crisis? And I don't think there's a question mark on this. Yeah. The real crisis, without a question mark, at Sweetbriar. Maybe if you can summarize what's going on for viewers who may not be familiar with that, and then your suggestions as to what Sweetbriar ought to be doing.
Well, again, Sweetbriar is a small college in about 700 women, and it's all women's college in southwestern Virginia, and it recently announced that it's going to close. It says it has found that it really doesn't see a future for itself. It's got a big, beautiful campus, and it actually has an $85 million endowment. So a lot of people are questioning, why is this college going to close? I will say that it's interesting the attention that college has received for 700 students. We've been writing recently about a for-profit college company called Corinthian Colleges, which recently just closed a bunch of its campuses, and then that affected 16,000 students. So those issues there are different, but there's been a lot of attention paid to Sweetbriar, in part because people are seeing it somewhat as emblematic of the challenges facing the small private college right now. I think to some degree it is an emblem, but in some ways it certainly is not. First of all, it's a women's college, and there aren't that many women's colleges in the country left. And so there are a lot of other small colleges around the country that don't have that challenge of trying to find young women who want to attend a rural college in the country. It also, I mean, unlike a lot of colleges that are financially struggling, it actually has an endowment. Although people at the college will say that they can't really spend the endowment as freely as they like to, because I think they said something like 65 million of the 85 million is restricted, meaning it can only be used for certain things. So it's not like they have this pool of money that they can go off and invest in a whole new venture that's going to start to attract a whole lot of other students. It is, to a lot of people who are predicting the death of the death of small colleges, the death of liberal arts colleges, they're holding up Sweetbriar as some kind of the canary in the coal mine. But I do think the circumstances there are a little bit special, because it is rural, because it is all women's college. Frankly, its reputation had been of a sort of a rich young women's college, and in fact, they have actually been, over the last 10 or 15 years, enrolling a lot more lower income students, which has cost them a lot of money in financial aid as well. And a lot of their students, I think something like 40% of their students qualify for federal Pell Grants, which means they're low income students. And Pell Grants only go so far. The college needs to come up with the rest of the financial aid to cover the balance, and that's just become a kind of a burden for that school. In that respect, it may be a bit of bellwether.
But why shouldn't other schools be concerned about this?
Oh, they definitely should be concerned, because Sweetbriar had a niche, and then it sort of lost its niche. It didn't lose its niche. Its niche kind of lost them. So it didn't have a plan B or a plan C. But a lot of other colleges do have a plan B and C. Right here in Washington, D.C., we have Trinity University, which was also a women's college for years and years. And about 10 or 15 years ago, maybe 20, it sort of shifted its model. It still is a women's college, but it also created a very extensive graduate program to attract adult students. And on nights and weekends, that campus is brimming with students, and this college is financially very strong.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that school, because Pat McGuire was on this show a while ago, and she's a force of nature.
Right, well, that helps too, actually. To have that's the other thing. You have to have a certain kind of a leadership to run, especially when you're in a turnaround situation. If you don't have the right leadership at the school, or people who, maybe it is that vice president for marketing communications who sees the niche. That's why I'm not saying categorically that that's the wrong position to have. But you do have to have a plan A and a plan B. The Sweetbriar trustees, ultimately, they said that they've looked at other options. Apparently they looked at mergers with some other schools, including possibly UVA. It's a little unclear who they've talked to, but they've been a little secretive about that. And they just sort of saw no way out. They didn't see a future where they could grow to a point where the school would become solvent.
But I find this interesting, because if you look at a school like Elon in North Carolina, which you may remember used to be Elon College, but now Elon University, one could have made the case 20 or 30 years ago that Elon was having trouble competing against UNC or Duke or other universities. But they seem to have done quite well in terms of marketing themselves to a particular niche of students. Why couldn't Sweetbriar do that?
Well, part of it's some of it is location, and part of it is the single-sex school. Elon's co-ed. More students want to go to a co-ed school than a single-sex school these days. I think, if I'm remembering correctly, I think Elon also did a little bit with graduate programs or professional programs. They stopped having the niche of just being called a liberal arts college in the traditional sense, and they started to adapt other majors that were sort of more attractive to today's students. A lot of students who are going to college today, like almost 9 out of 10 of them, when they answer that survey, why are you going? As freshmen, they all say to get a good job. There's a much more of a professionally focused young student body today, and I think Elon shifted some of its majors to go for some of those students.
And that's certainly true that a disproportionate number of students say that they're interested in going to university for jobs. So we know that as a fact, but yet as a sector, we invest a ton of money in the liberal arts. And there seems to be this incredible disconnect between the amount of money that we're spending in the liberal arts on one hand versus the other hand, students and parents who are focused on jobs.
I'm a liberal arts college graduate, so I have a personal dog in this fight, although I do see the issue on both sides. I think what you're seeing a lot of liberal arts colleges right now are sort of scrambling in effect to explain, and I think they can explain, the way in which the liberal arts education does, help someone with their career. It might not train them for that very first job right out of college. They might not learn the specific accounting thing that they need to go for that first job. And that's a problem because companies aren't necessarily offering as much training as they used to be. But I still think in the broadest sense, the liberal arts education is kind of the best preparation for a college-minded student in the looking at the 21st century, thinking about the changes, the coming globalization. We're going to live in a much more interconnected world. We already do. We're going to live in a world where technology will matter a lot more to us. We're going to live in a world where of diversity that's going to be a lot, we're going to need to understand the cultures in a very different way, or else we are probably going to be very doomed as a society. And I think all those things are part of what a liberal arts education provides. To some degree, let's hope all college education hopefully provides a little bit of that. Frankly, there's a movement in the country, and it seems kind of bureaucratic, and a lot of people aren't that familiar with it. But there is a movement and an association of about 1,000 colleges right now that are trying to promote some of these liberal, they don't call it liberal arts education, that's too boutique-y a term and it doesn't go over that well, so they now call it liberal education. And they're trying to really imbue some of those educational models into traditional, even into business majors, into accounting majors, into some of the other professional majors that are out there, and make sure that all those majors kind of have some of the same skills that you get from a liberal arts major, in undergraduate research, maybe doing what's called a capstone project, where you kind of take your own, you go off and you do you develop something from start to finish in a coherent way, internships, some of these other things that liberal arts colleges traditionally emphasize.
But it almost seems, with all due respect, and I almost went to Colgate, for the record. I like Colgate. I've visited Colgate many times. But it seems like we're almost doing smoke and mirrors about liberal arts when the public really wants something different from the liberal arts, but yet the liberal arts keep saying, well, they're so important, they're so important. If they were so important, why wouldn't the public come to recognize that?
I think you're right. They are playing a little bit of a game of smoke and mirrors. I was on a panel with this association that I just mentioned, and there were 4 people from associations who got up there and talked about their campaigns to promote the liberal arts, and make people understand the value of the habits of the mind, and train students to be citizens of the nation and citizens of the world. And I got up there afterwards and told them what I'd been hearing while I'd been out talking about my book. And what I'd been hearing, of course, is concerns about student debt, concerns about student learning, and I never once heard the phrase "habits of the mind" from anybody who called in on a radio show or anything. At the same time, I think that it's just so important that the message has changed a little bit in the public, but I do think what you get out of a liberal arts education, or what a traditional college education provides, is so vitally important. And I think maybe they're fighting the good fight against something else, but I think it's a fight worth fighting, because you can't give up on these values, and some of this stuff, it really matters.
And let's assume that it does matter, but in the free market, I mean, we value things that tend to work. And if 90% of students are not interested in it, and for women's colleges, which you mentioned before, which we talked about before, if I'm not mistaken, it's either 96 or 97% of American high school girls are unwilling to consider a women's college. So we have an incredible disconnect. So does the Chronicle of Higher Education keep writing about it? Does this show keep talking about it? Do professors just keep talking about it? Meanwhile, the market share gets smaller and smaller.
Well, to some degree, yeah. It'll get at some colleges that are sort of sticking primarily to, some single-sex colleges in rural parts of the country. By the way, we're also much more of an urbanizing nation, and I think while I went to a college in the rural part of the country, and it felt a lot more rural back then. Fewer people are sort of interested in that these days. And small colleges like Sweetbriar, also financially, it's really hard to manage a college. You know, you have a lot of expenses that you have to amortize over 700 students as opposed to a bigger school. So yeah, a lot of smaller colleges will suffer, I think, particularly in this environment, because they're going to have a hard time making the case that it's worth it for their curriculum, it's worth it for their location, it's worth it for their that even that in rural environment, they won't be able to sell that. And we will see some colleges closing, I think, in that respect, and probably more likely those in rural areas than in urban ones. But I'm sure there are plenty of, there are plenty of urban schools too that are facing some tough challenges. But to the broader question of are we teaching students the wrong things? I mean, at some level, there's this movement out there. There's this whole alternative education movement. You can take MOOCs and go massive open online course, and you can take a class and take a bunch of classes through MOOCs. That's not quite a college education. That's like going to the library. There is something about a curriculum that a college offers that does have some value.
But why does the system have to be the way that it always was?
Oh, it doesn't, and it's changing. I mean, I think the MOOC thing, for example, is, while I don't think anyone would want to go get their entire college degree through MOOCs, I think it's pretty likely in the next few years that we'll have students who get, a couple of credits out of their 8 semesters, and some of those will be MOOC credits.
We did a show a while ago with the people from the MIT OpenCourseWare, and also the woman who started the program at Carnegie Mellon. And they talked about incredible numbers of students who were taking courses, both from Carnegie Mellon and MIT, most of whom were in Africa.
Mm-hmm. Through that online learning initiative at Carnegie Mellon. Yeah, and also some of the courses, I don't know that much about the MIT OpenCourseWare. Some of the Carnegie Mellon courses they're somewhat amazing. I mean, they use a lot of really cool technology, they use adaptive learning techniques now where, you and I might be taking the same class, but you might be served up the course in a slightly different way than I did because your learning style is different than mine. That's some of the interesting developments that I think will change higher education going forward, as some of that adaptive learning makes its way more into the classes that they offer at traditional colleges.
Well, and in terms of, we've only have a few minutes left, but in terms of your job at the Chronicle, could you say a word or two about how it was different 20 or 25 years ago than it is right now?
Yeah, I can actually, because it occurred to me a lot when I was working on the book. In one respect, what's very different is who I talk to these days. When I started at the Chronicle, I spent my sources, the people who were my experts, were primarily people who worked in the building we call 1 DuPont. It's this building right here in Washington, D.C., where a lot of the higher education associations are based. They represent the community colleges, they represent the public land grants or that sort of thing. Today, I still talk to those groups, but I increasingly talk to a whole other sector of people. I talk to associations of trustees who have more demands about colleges, and they're trying to become better and more rigorous stewards of higher education. I talk to a lot more think tanks, as we were hinting at before. There are a lot more think tanks right now who are weighing in daily, sometimes twice a day, with reports, with recommendations on ways to change the student aid system, ways to improve student retention, ways to encourage competency-based education. And so, a whole host of those groups are out there right now. And frankly, I talk today to business people in a way that I never used to talk to before. Investors and companies that run for-profit colleges, that's one small part of that. Companies that now help colleges put their distance education courses online. I talk to a whole lot of companies that are involved with other forms of educational technology. Some of them, like the Open Learning Initiative, that's not a company, that's a private, that's a nonprofit, but there's a spin-off of that company and others. All these companies are developing educational technology and personalized learning systems and retention systems that use big data. All those people are having an influence on higher education, and they didn't even exist when I started.
And is that good or bad?
It's different. I think it creates a lot more challenges for people who run colleges, and in some respects it creates a lot more opportunities for students. I think a lot of this ed tech stuff isn't yet proven, and it may all be, we might be in another ed tech bubble like we were in 2000, but a lot of it is really quite promising. I mean, the fact that these companies are really trying to use technology to teach us about the universe, to teach us about science, to teach us about cultures that we wouldn't be able to touch. You know, we can't go visit some of these places in a classroom, but now we can through technology. And some of the stuff is starting to get pretty good. So I think that is really quite exciting for students.
Well, fair enough. Last thing, Goldie, because then we're going to have to say goodbye.
Okay.
Any last-minute advice for a high school student or a mom or dad who's watching this, thinking about the higher education sector in the future?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, and it sounds easy, it's a little glib to say it, but be mindful of the affordability issue, because you can find I think there's a lot of great choices out there, and I think families just need to be careful that they don't get themselves in over their head. There are a lot of great places to go to college, and there's a lot of research right now that says how you go to college, if you get the right experiences out of college, it doesn't matter so much where you go. I think that's true to a point, so make sure wherever you're looking at, it has the internship opportunities that you want to go to. You have the opportunity to engage with faculty or other people as mentors, and you have the opportunity to do hands-on activities in your community that will relate to your scholarship. Those are some practices that I think everyone thinks are now quite valuable for a college education, no matter where you go.
Fair enough. Goldie, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, Steve.
If you would like additional information about Goldie Blumenstyk, please visit chronicle.com. If you have comments or suggestions about higher education today, please send an email to our viewer mailbox at highereducationtoday@topcolleges.com. Thank you for watching. We will continue to bring you quality discussions about important matters in today's college and university world. Please join me again for another edition of Higher Education Today. I'm Steven Roy Goodman, and you've been watching Higher Education Today.